My granddaughter's college graduation was supposed to be the happiest day of our family's life, and for most of the morning, it was. I remember standing outside the venue in my navy blue dress, watching my granddaughter Eleanor walk across that parking lot in her cap and gown, her diploma tucked under her arm, her face glowing in a way I hadn't seen since she was a little girl unwrapping Christmas presents. 63 years of living, and I can tell you honestly, that moment ranked among the most beautiful things I had ever witnessed. What happened 2 hours later at the celebration dinner nearly destroyed everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because this story doesn't make sense without it. Eleanor had worked herself to the bone for that degree. 4 years at Ohio State studying business administration while working 20 hours a week at a campus coffee shop to help cover her expenses. Her mother, my daughter Patricia, had done what she could, but Patricia raised Eleanor alone after her father left when Eleanor was 9, and money was never something we had in abundance. What we lacked in money, though, we made up for in stubbornness. That girl inherited it from both sides. 6 months before graduation, Eleanor landed an internship at a mid-sized marketing firm in Columbus called Hargrove and Associates. The internship paid well, and more importantly, the company had a reputation for converting strong interns into full-time hires. Eleanor threw herself into it completely. She came home some nights talking about campaign strategies and client presentations with the kind of fire in her eyes that told me this was exactly where she was meant to be. That's where she met Connor Hargrove. Connor was the son of the firm's founder, Gerald Hargrove. He was 31 years old, good-looking in a practice sort of way, and he had the easy confidence of someone who had never once worried about where his next meal was coming from. He and Eleanor started dating about 2 months into her internship. I'll be honest, my instincts were cautious from the start. Not about Connor specifically, not yet, but about the situation. When a young woman is an intern at a company and starts dating the boss's son, the power dynamics are never simple, no matter how genuine the feelings might be. But Eleanor was happy, genuinely happy, and Connor, in the early months, seemed to treat her well. He was attentive, he came to her study sessions with coffee, he told her she was the smartest person in the building. I watched and waited and kept my reservations to myself. Gerald Hargrove, however, was another matter entirely. I met him for the first time at a dinner Eleanor organized about 3 months into her relationship with Connor. Gerald was a tall man, probably mid-60s, with silver hair and the particular kind of handshake that's meant to tell you immediately who has the power in the room. He was charming enough at the surface, but over the course of that dinner I noticed things. He interrupted Eleanor 4 times while she was speaking, not rudely enough that anyone would call it out directly, but consistently enough that I counted. He made a comment about Eleanor's career goals. She had mentioned wanting to eventually move into executive strategy, and he laughed in a way that wasn't quite a laugh. "That's ambitious," he said, drawing out the word ambitious like it was synonymous with delusional. I noticed Patricia's jaw tighten. I noticed Eleanor smile through it. I kept my mouth shut and cut my chicken. Over the following months, I heard more from Eleanor than she probably intended to share. Little things, mostly. Gerald had apparently made a comment in a team meeting about how personal relationships shouldn't cloud professional evaluations, said directly in front of Connor and Eleanor in front of their colleagues, in a way that made Eleanor feel as though her position at the firm was being questioned because of who she was dating, not what she was producing. Another time, Connor had relayed to Eleanor that his father had privately suggested Connor was moving too fast with a girl who came from a different background. A different background. I've been around long enough to know exactly what that kind of phrase is designed to communicate. Eleanor, to her enormous credit, responded to all of this by working harder. Her performance reviews were outstanding. She was offered the full-time position 3 months before her graduation, on her own merit, reviewed by a department head who had no personal connection to Gerald Hargrove. I watched her read that offer letter at my kitchen table and burst into tears of relief, and I felt something loosen in my own chest that I hadn't realized had been tight. Gerald, when told the news, reportedly said, "Well, let's hope she can keep up when the real work starts." Connor told Eleanor this, and Connor inexplicably seemed to think it was simply his father being his father. the kind of thing you learn to let roll off your back. Eleanor again smiled and let it go. I did not let it go, but I said nothing. The graduation celebration dinner was held at a private room in a restaurant in downtown Columbus, a place called Whitmore's, the kind of restaurant where the menus don't have prices and the lighting is designed to make everyone look important. Gerald had offered to host, and Eleanor, wanting to keep the peace, had accepted. The guest list was our family: myself, Patricia, Eleanor's aunt and uncle from Cleveland, and the Hargrove side, which included Gerald, his wife Margaret, Connor, and Gerald's brother with his wife. I arrived early, and I remember feeling something I couldn't quite name. A low-level alertness, like the feeling you get before a storm and the air pressure changes and the birds go quiet. The first hour was fine. We ordered drinks. Gerald held court at his end of the table, telling a long story about some business deal he had closed in the early 90s. Margaret smiled at appropriate intervals. Connor sat next to Eleanor and refilled her water glass without being asked, which I noted with cautious approval. Then came the toast. Patricia went first. She stood up with her glass of white wine and her voice cracked twice before she finished, talking about the little girl who used to sit at the kitchen counter doing homework, who never once complained about the sacrifices, who made her mother proud every single day. There were genuine tears at the table. Even Margaret dabbed her eye. Connor went next. Brief, warm, said Eleanor was the most determined person he had ever met, and that being with her had made him want to be better. I thought, this is fine. This is a nice young man. Maybe I was wrong to be cautious. Then Gerald stood up. He picked up his glass of bourbon. He'd had 2 already, and he cleared his throat in the manner of someone who has been waiting for their turn and intends to make the most of it. Well, he said, smiling around the table, I suppose I should say something, given that our family is now rather intertwined with this one. I watched Eleanor's face. The smile she put on was the smile I recognized, the one she'd been practicing for months. Eleanor, Gerald continued, has been with our firm for nearly a year now. And I'll be honest with you all, when Connor first told me he was seeing one of our interns, I had concerns. The table went quiet. Not the warm quiet of a meaningful toast, but the prickling quiet of a room that senses something is going wrong. But she's been, and here he paused, tilting his glass slightly as though weighing the words adequate. More than adequate, perhaps, for where she is right now. Adequate, more than adequate, perhaps, for where she is right now. Adequate. I heard Patricia inhale sharply beside me. Gerald wasn't finished. He smiled at Eleanor in the way that people smile when they want credit for being generous. My advice to you, Eleanor, is simple. You got this far on drive and determination, and that's admirable. But drive and determination will only take a girl so far in this industry. You'll need to learn to listen more than you talk, and you'll need to understand that your being in this firm is, in some ways, a courtesy. He raised his glass. To Eleanor. May she grow into the position. There was a terrible silence. Connor looked mortified. Patricia looked like she had swallowed something sharp. My aunt from Cleveland made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a gasp. Eleanor picked up her glass and smiled. Thank you, Gerald, she said, in a voice so controlled it broke my heart. That was when I stood up. I want to be clear about something. I did not stand up impulsively. I have been on this earth for 63 years, and I learned a long time ago that the moments that matter most require you to think clearly, not just feel deeply. In the 3 seconds between Gerald sitting down and me rising from my chair, I made a decision. I knew what I was about to do. I knew the consequences. I chose to do it anyway, and I would choose it again. I stood and I picked up my glass and I said, I'd like to say something if no one minds. Gerald waved his hand in the magnanimous way of a man who believes he controls the room. I've been watching my granddaughter navigate your family and your firm for the better part of a year, I said, keeping my voice even. And I've watched her respond to every slight, every condescending comment, every little concern, with nothing but grace and professionalism. So I want to take a moment to address something directly, Gerald. The room had gone very still. You called her adequate. You told her she's there as a courtesy. You have spent 12 months quietly communicating to this young woman that she is somehow lesser, less capable, less deserving, less than what you consider the standard. Gerald's expression shifted. The benevolent smile thinned. So I think it's only fair, I said, reaching down and picking up my phone from beside my plate, that this table knows a few things about who is sitting at the head of it. Connor said, "Wait." But Patricia put her hand briefly on the table and he stopped. I had not planned to bring documentation to a graduation dinner, but 2 weeks earlier, I had been doing something I'm not entirely proud of, which was worrying. Worrying about Eleanor, about her future at that firm, about the man who seemed to hold quiet power over her career. And worrying for me has always manifested as research. A former colleague of mine, a woman named Ruth, who spent 30 years in corporate accounting before retiring to Sarasota, had worked briefly in Columbus's business community in the late 90s and early 2000s. When I mentioned Gerald Hargrove's name to her during one of our regular phone calls, Ruth went quiet in a way that told me she recognized it. What she told me next, I verified. Not once, but 3 times, using public court records that are available to anyone with internet access and patience. 12 years ago, Gerald Hargrove had been named in a civil lawsuit brought by 4 former employees of his first company, a smaller firm he had run before Hargrove and Associates, alleging systematic wage theft, unpaid overtime, withheld bonuses that had been promised in writing. The case had been settled out of court. The settlement terms were confidential, but the filing itself, the names of the plaintiffs, the detailed allegations, those were public record. 2 of those 4 plaintiffs were young women in their mid-20s at the time of the lawsuit. Both had been described in the filing as high-performing employees who had been passed over for promotions that went to less qualified male colleagues. One of them had written in her deposition, and this was in the public record, that her supervisor had told her she was not quite the caliber we're looking for in leadership, despite having the highest performance ratings in her department. Not quite the caliber. Adequate. I looked at Gerald Hargrove across the table, and I read from the document I had pulled up on my phone. I did not editorialize. I read the case number, the filing date, the names of the plaintiffs, and the key language from the allegations. I read the part about the 2 young women and the promotions they had been denied. I read the phrase hostile and diminishing work environment from the filing summary. I set my phone down. "Eleanor has a full-time offer at your firm," I said. "She earned it. Not as a courtesy. She earned it the way those 4 people earned their wages, through work, delivered in good faith, to a man who was sitting in judgment of them." The silence in that room was unlike any I'd experienced before. It had weight to it. Gerald's face had moved through several expressions during my reading. Surprise first, then a flash of something that might have been fear, then the careful reconstruction of composure. Margaret was staring at the centerpiece. Connor was staring at the table. My family was very still. "That is a settled matter," Gerald said finally, and his voice was controlled, but not quite steady. "Ancient history. You have no idea what the context." "The context," I said quietly, "is sitting right here at this table. A young woman who just graduated with honors, who earned a competitive internship and then a full-time offer on her merits, being told by you tonight at her graduation dinner that she is adequate, that she is a courtesy." I sat down. What happened next was not dramatic in the way of movies. No one threw anything. No one stormed out immediately. But the dinner was effectively over. The plates were cleared in a silence so heavy you could hear the server's footsteps. Margaret excused herself to the restroom and did not come back for 15 minutes. Gerald spoke only once more the entire evening, to ask for the check. Connor drove Eleanor home. I didn't know until the following morning what was said between them in that car. Patricia and I sat in my kitchen until past midnight. She was angry, not at me, but at the situation, at the accumulation of it, at all the times Eleanor had smiled or comments that didn't deserve a smile. We drank tea and we talked, and eventually she said, "Mom, I need to ask you something. Do you think Eleanor will be okay? At the firm?" It was the right question, and I've been sitting with it since I stood up at that table. "I think," I said, "that what happened tonight made it very clear to everyone in that room, including Connor, exactly what kind of man his father is. What they do with that clarity is up to them. It was not a satisfying answer, but it was the true one. The days that followed were difficult. Eleanor called me the morning after, and her voice was careful in the way it gets when she's sorting through too many feelings at once. She thanked me. Then she said, "Grandma, I need you to understand that I still have to work there." "I know," I said, "and Gerald is still Connor's father." "I know that too." There was a long pause. "I'm not angry at you," she said finally. I need some time to understand how I feel about all of it." I told her to take all the time she needed. I meant it. Connor, as it turned out, knew nothing about the lawsuit. He was 11 years old when it was filed, and the settlement had been handled quietly enough that it had never entered his consciousness as anything significant. According to what Eleanor later shared with me, the car ride home had been one of the harder conversations of their relationship. Connor was shaken. He had questions. He called his father that night, and by all accounts, the conversation did not go well. 2 weeks after the dinner, Eleanor started her full-time position at Hargrove and Associates. She told me Gerald had not addressed what happened at the dinner, and she had not brought it up. The atmosphere, she said, was professional and cool. She was doing her job. What I had not anticipated, what I genuinely had not foreseen, was what happened with the former employees. One of the women named in that lawsuit, a woman named Diane, was now 40 years old and living in Cincinnati. She had started a small consulting business of her own after leaving the industry for several years. Somehow, I am still not entirely clear on the sequence of events. Word reached her that the court documents had been referenced publicly in connection with Gerald Hargrove's name. She reached out through a mutual professional contact to the one person at the dinner who had later spoken publicly about what occurred that night. That person was Connor's aunt, Gerald's sister-in-law, who had been one of the quieter guests at the table, but who had apparently found the courage in the weeks following to speak about what she had witnessed to people in her own social circle. Diane, it turned out, had never fully let go of what had happened to her. She had settled because she had a young child and couldn't afford to fight, not because she believed the settlement was just. When she learned that the documents were surfacing again, that someone had done the research and had held them up publicly without flinching, she made a decision of her own. She contacted an attorney. I learned about this through Ruth, my accountant friend in Sarasota, who had a way of staying connected to more threads than I fully understood. I won't pretend I fully grasped the legal implications of what Diane was exploring, but Ruth told me, quietly, that Diane wasn't the only one, that the original 4 plaintiffs were apparently still in contact with one another, and that what had felt like a closed door 12 years ago felt, for some of them, slightly less closed. I don't know how this will end. I want to be honest with you about that. What I know is this. Eleanor is still at the firm. She told me last week that her first major project, a campaign for a regional retail client, had gone well enough that the department head had asked her to lead the follow-up work. Gerald Hargrove, she said, has not spoken to her directly since the dinner. She and Connor are still together, still working through the complicated reality of loving someone whose father is who he is. Patricia asked me recently whether I regretted standing up at that dinner. I thought about it for a long moment before answering because she deserved a real answer and not a reflexive one. The truth is that I do not regret the decision, but I have made peace with the fact that it was not the only decision available to me and that reasonable people I respect, might have made a different one. I could have gone to Connor privately. I could have sent the documents to Eleanor and let her choose what to do with them. I could have waited and watched and hoped that Gerald Hargrove would eventually reveal himself on his own terms. I chose not to wait. I chose the moment when he had just told my granddaughter, in front of her entire family, that she was adequate, that she was a courtesy. I chose that moment because I was there, and the evidence was there, and I had spent 12 months watching a young woman sand down her own edges to fit into a space that kept being made smaller. I am 63 years old. I have made my share of mistakes in this life, and I have the specific wisdom of someone who has lived long enough to know which regrets are the sharp ones that don't dull over time. Not acting when you had the ability to act when the moment was right there in front of you, that's the kind of regret that doesn't dull. So yes, I stood up, and I would stand up again. What I want you to understand, What I most want you to take away from all of this is not the moment I stood up. That moment lasted maybe 4 minutes. What matters is the 12 months before it, and the weeks after, and the ongoing daily work of a young woman who did not let any of this make her smaller. Eleanor is not adequate. She never was. And no one, not a man with silver hair and a bourbon glass, not a title, not a private settlement from 12 years ago that he thought had been buried, gets to stand at the head of a table and say otherwise, not while I'm sitting at it. If you're watching this and you have someone in your life who is being told, quietly or loudly, in corporate language or plain language, that they're less than what they are, I hope you'll remember that you don't have to wait for a perfect moment. Sometimes the moment chooses you. And sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to sit down. I picked up my phone. I stood up. I said what needed to be said. The rest is still being written.